Good, welcome. This class is going to be kind of mystical. We're going to get right to the heart of things as far as our relationship with God per Rabbi Kaplan. First, some preliminaries. Let us share screen. And where are we going to go? We're going to go here. Can you see that? Here's our website.
Yes.
Okay. So this is really cool. My assistant Charlene put this together for us. And it has the introduction in the front, as you see. It has a summary of what each class is going to be about, the upcoming class. It has class notes, which people are asking for. So hold on a second. Class notes are right here. Class notes have a drop down by month. So hold on. Let's just go back. Let's see if we can get this to work. Looks like there's a glitch. Class notes are there though, so hold on. Let's go to recorded classes, see if they work. Yep, there's all the recordings. Give it one last try for the class notes. How about if we go over here? All right, this will be fixed tomorrow. But in any event, we're putting the class notes on by month. I'm going to have Charlene fix this tomorrow. Make a note for that. Plus, we're going to have, what else are we going to have? Recommended reading list and links to helpful websites and the blog. So there's going to be a lot of good resources on here. The website will serve truly as a resource room for this class. So the URL is on all the emails now. It's in your text, and it's also posted in the Facebook group. So now, very, very, very good. We're going to stop share there, and we're going to go back and take a look at the notes for today. Okay, checked out the website. Here's a question from a student. I was planning on trying to do tonight's meditation standing, but decided against it since I often go deep enough that I may lose my balance or be taken away from the meditative state by focusing on staying balanced. Your thoughts on that? I do have thoughts on that. I'm sure that's a familiar question to you, Sue Ellen. We're going to cover this before we start the meditation tonight, but I do have some items to share with you. Okay, let's go back to Rabbi Kaplan and pick up his discussion about the Amidah as a form of prayer, as a form of meditation through prayer. This section's talking about relating to God through the Amidah. We're going to take a look at Jewish meditation. Here we go. This is what he says. As we discussed in the previous chapter, the first paragraph of the Amidah is the most important element of the service for use as a meditation. Moreover, this blessing defines the I-thou relationship between the worshiper and God. Be mindful of that. I-thou, we're going to get into that. Let us explore this paragraph word by word. The first blessing of the Amidah is, blessed are you, Adonai, our God and the God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. Great, mighty, and awesome God, highest God. doer of good, kind deeds, master of all, who remembers the love of the patriarchs and brings a redeemer to their children's children for his name's sake with love. King, helper, rescuer, and shield. Blessed are you, Adonai, shield of God. The first word of the Amidah is blessed, or Baruch in Hebrew. It is difficult to understand what the term blessed means when applied to God. A person can be blessed to have life, health, prosperity, children, and other benefits, but what does it mean when we say that God is blessed? Key question. If we look at blessings in the Bible, we always find that God is giving the recipient of the blessing some good or benefit. For example, Isaac says to Jacob, "May God give you from the dew of heaven and from the fat of the earth." That's in Bereshit. The main point of this and other blessings in the Bible is that God will be granting the recipient a special providence, and that he, meaning God, will have a special relationship and closeness to the one receiving the blessing. So in Rabbi Kaplan's understanding, when you say, "You are blessed, God," blessed, we're meaning basically saying we're blessed by something God gives us that's good or for our benefit. So then the question is, why aren't we saying, "I am blessed"? That's a really good question. Everybody asks that question. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it has something to do with the idea of who we think God is. And more, what we think is happening when we pray, and are we really in a position to say, what's the right way to address somebody who's almost unaddressable? That's kind of metaphysical, and we're going to get into that a little bit. Okay. So according to Rabbi Kaplan's understanding, if when we start talking about a blessing, we're getting closer to God, he's therefore saying that a blessing is therefore an expression of God's immanence. When we say that God is blessed, we are saying that his immanent presence is the source of all blessings. We're going right to the source. We're basically saying that particular thing that I think is good or for my benefit is a blessing, but before I recognize it, I've got to give thanks to the source of all good things, the source of all blessings. So the idea is to go right to the original source first, and give your thanks to that source, and then you work your way forward. So, okay. This implies that God is close, very close to us. Many Jewish sources indicate that the word blessed specifically denotes God's immanence in the world. So when we say blessed, to start off a blessing, Baruch, we're basically telling ourselves to recognize God's right here. We just have to, in essence, open our eyes to recognize his presence and recognize that he's the source of all the things that we wish for, hope for, want to happen. Okay. When we recite the word blessed or Baruch in the Amidah, we should be aware that God is very close, permeating the very air around us. We should feel God in our bones, in our flesh, in our minds, in the deepest recesses of our soul. We should also be aware that God makes himself available in order to enhance our closeness to him. Okay, how do we do that? And how do we feel God in our bones? I think it's easier said than done. We're going to try to learn a little bit about how to do that as we continue. Okay, the next word is you, atah in Hebrew. This word refers to the I-thou relationship that we have with God. Again, he's bringing up I-thou relationship. And again, keep that in mind because we're going to go into that a little bit in depth. Simply saying you to God makes us aware that we are speaking directly to him. When we say this word, we should be aware of the divine directly in front of us and feel all the love, strength, and awe that exists when we confront the divine. Okay, so once again, the second word in this blessing is supposed to remind us that we have this relationship, so to speak, with God. And I say so to speak because as we understand God, it's hard to understand having a relationship with somebody that's not physical, so to speak, but we'll get into that. And if we have the right mindset, the idea that he's right here and we're speaking to him, and if you understand his immenseness, maybe that can help permeate, maybe that will help the idea permeate our being. Let's see what he says about that. Third word, then comes God's name, which in Hebrew is pronounced Adonai. This name is actually written in the Tetragrammaton, the Yud K Vav K, but since this most holy name may not be pronounced, the name Adonai, which means my Lord, is substituted. This substitution teaches us some very important lessons about the divine. The meaning of the Tetragrammaton, again, those 4 letters, on one level has been discussed earlier. Okay, here's a way of understanding it deeper. The codes, different scriptures note that this 4-letter word implies past, present, and future. In the Hebrew word to be, was is haya, is hoveh, and will be is yihyeh. These 4 letters imply the root in Hebrew that means past, present, and future. Therefore, when one sees this word with the 4 letters, one should have in mind that God was, is, and will be all at once. This indicates that God is utterly transcendental, higher even than the realm of time. God exists in a realm where time does not exist. So this is like a Zen situation. Our understanding of those 4 letters, the word that comprises those 4 letters, points to an existence that we really can't comprehend because we're not built to comprehend the past, present, and future all at once. I can't do it. I don't know if you could do it. I haven't come across somebody that can. So there's saying that word and understanding what it means is supposed to be a trigger that we are confronted with something that we can't use our regular mind for, that we have to take a step back and appreciate in a more holistic manner, whatever that means. But we can't perceive this unperceivable thing the way we perceive the food on our dinner table type thing. This also implies that God is totally different from anything else in creation. We cannot even begin to imagine a being existing outside of space, for whom the very concept of space does not apply. It is even more difficult to imagine a being who exists outside of time, so much so that past, present, and future are all the same to him. Our very thought processes are dependent on time and can function only within the framework of time, yet none of this applies to God. So again, no time, no space. We're pushing ourselves to use a different mode of thinking, because our ordinary mode of thinking deals with time and space, but we want to go beyond that. Okay, so you can see how, when properly understood, the prayer is supposed to be a transcendental experience in some way. And as we've learned so far, you need to have certain skills to be able to think transcendentally. And those skills come from meditation. Of course, even to use the word being with relation to God is a misnomer and anthropomorphism. The only reason that we think of God as a being is so that we can speak to him, and being is the only category into which we can fit that to which we can speak. Of course, the fact that being is the closest category into which we can place God does not mean that he is a being. Okay, there's no category into which we can place God. Okay. Okay. So we're dealing with a certain paradox here. Okay. How does Rabbi Kaplan deal with this paradox of helping people deal with a being, relate to a being that can't be defined, that can't be described in terms we use, but encourage us to have a relationship with it and try to understand, if not the being, at least understand something about ourselves in relation to the being. Okay, this is what he says. And this is dealing with the paradox right here. Being versus principle. There are two major supercategories in our minds into which all things can be placed, that of things and that of relationships or states. If we could place God in the category of things, then we would speak of him as a being. However, if we placed him in the category of relationships, we would speak of him as a principle. Okay, so this is how Rabbi Kaplan is helping us understand something that exists beyond time and space. He's calling it a principle. Thus, when we say that God is the creator of the universe, we are speaking of him as a being. On the other hand, when we say God is the creative force in the universe, we are speaking of him as a principle. And then Rabbi Kaplan shares something from his teaching experience. He says, the first time I used this concept in a class, one of my students asked a simple but very tricky question. If God exists outside of space, how can we say that God is everywhere? So, because everywhere is a spatial concept. So how can we say that God is everywhere when he doesn't occupy space? Everywhere implies some kind of space. It's a pretty clever question. After a few moments of thought, says Rabbi Kaplan, the idea struck me. I asked the class, does the equation 1 + 1 = 2 exist in space? The class's response was that this equation obviously does not exist in space. The equation 1 + 1 = 2 is not a thing that can exist in space, but rather a mathematical relationship. It is a mathematical principle, and as such, it exists in the world of ideas and not in space. Okay, so he's first saying, if you want to understand something that doesn't occupy space, or use this principle, use a mathematical formula. It's an idea. It doesn't take up any space. So then, according to this story, then I asked another question. Is there any place where 1 + 1 = 2 does not exist? The obvious answer was no. Wherever one would go in the entire universe and beyond, one would find that 1 + 1 = 2. This simple equation is a good example of something that does not exist in space and yet, at the same time, exists everywhere. Pretty clever. This is true of every universal principle. By nature, an abstract principle is not spatial and therefore exists outside of space. Yet, if we are speaking of a universal principle, such as any of the principles of mathematics, there is no place where it does not exist. Okay, so on the one hand, this equation doesn't exist in space. The equation itself doesn't exist in a space. It doesn't occupy space. But when you have space, it's in all spaces. There's no space anywhere where this guy and this guy = 2 guys. So that's his clever way of trying to explain how something can have no spatial qualities, but yet be everywhere, so to speak. That's his metaphor for how we talk about God. It's pretty clever. Okay. So for many purposes, it would be useful to think of God as a principle rather than a being. For one thing, it would make it readily understandable how he exists outside of space and time, yet fills all space and time. For another, an idea such as this breaks down the anthropomorphic ideas that people have about God. All right, so again, he's not saying that God is a mathematical principle. He's using this model to imply something about that unique quality about God, about he's everywhere, but he doesn't take up space. Okay. One may be tempted to say God is a principle. That's what I just said. However, as I discussed earlier, the sentence God is a statement that cannot be completed. God is the creator of all categories and therefore cannot fit into any of them. Both principle and being are approximations that we use because the mind has no category into which it can place God. And maybe that a third intermediate category might be a better approximation, but the mind has no example of it, and therefore such a category cannot be imagined. Nevertheless, through meditation, one can gain a glimmer of the nature of this third category. He's done this, I'm quite sure. I'm not sure, I don't know what it is. But he's basically saying that there is an advanced type of meditation which can help you get past this quandary of like something being beyond space, but existing in space kind of thing. Okay. The 4-letter word that we use for God appears to relate to God as a principle rather than as a being. It denotes God's existence in the past, the present, and future simultaneously, just like that of any other principle. Okay. Okay, nevertheless, it is not easy to relate to a principle which appears totally impersonal, and indeed it is. Okay, so on the one hand, he's presenting this quandary. On the one hand, we're saying that, okay, God's like a principle, like we just described, but how can you, is a principle that close? He just got over saying, when we're davening, we got to think God's right here. God's permeating my bones. But how can a principle permeate my bones? All right, so that's the problem. Okay, so how do we get around this? He goes, in prayer and worship, it is much easier to relate to God as a being. But he's not a being, but we need to relate to him. Okay, therefore, we do not pronounce the 4-letter word, but instead substitute Adonai, my Lord. This indicates that God is Lord and Master of all creation. And seeing God as Lord and Master, we are viewing him as a being rather than as a principle. Mastery and dominance are anthropomorphic concepts that are most fitting to a sentient being. So we're using Adonai, my Lord, to imply, well, if we're going to talk about him as a being, he's going to be like this overseeing being. He's going to be like the being of beings, at least. Okay. So we try to get close according to our limitations, understanding that we're never going to reach the end point. As we reach the name of God that is written in the 4-letter word and pronounce Adonai, we become aware that we are addressing a being dash principle, combination. We see God as the principle that gives existence to all things, yet at the same time, we see God as a being, and furthermore, as a being to whom we can relate. When we speak to God, it is as if we are communing with existence itself, but at the same time, speaking to it as if it were a person. At the same time, we realize God is more than existence, actually the principle that allows existence to be. Okay, so he's outlined the quandary, and how do we get past this? So he's God is a principle, as we use a principle to describe God, even though it's not really God that you can't really describe God, but we're trying to, because we're people. And at the same time, from a davening point of view, wanting to relate to this principle, we need to define him as a being, but he's not a being. Okay, that's really tough stuff. However, Martin Buber may be able to help a little bit. So Martin Buber wrote a book called I, Thou, and you may have read it. I read it a very long time ago. It's a remarkable book, and I have a feeling that Rabbi Kaplan read this book. Don't know, he hasn't quoted the book, but as you'll see, what Martin Buber is saying is pretty much what Rabbi Kaplan's saying, same terminology. Okay. Who is this man, Martin Buber? Okay. He was the descendant of the Maharam, which we'll talk about in a minute. He actually is Karl Marx is another notable relative, which we'll leave that out because who needs Karl Marx? Okay. So he's from the late 1800s into the 1900s, lived in the Ukraine. He has a connection to the Davidic line. Joined the Zionist movement in 1898. Met a woman who eventually converted. Became a professor at the University of Frankfurt, but Hitler comes to power and he says, I don't want this guy, let me out of here. Settled in Jerusalem, 1938, and became the best known Israeli philosopher. Okay, scholar of Hasidism, wrote frequently about it. And very interesting, one of the things that he wrote about was the Hasidic ideal that a life lived in the unconditional presence of God, which is what we're talking about with the Amidah, imagining and trying to feel that you're in the presence of God. In that life, there's no distinct separation between daily habits and religious experience. It's not as if you're doing something unreligious and then then you're doing something religious. Okay. He published a book about the tales of Rabbi Nachman. And he published a book called I and Thou. Okay. Okay. He used the words, and I don't speak Yiddish or Hebrew, ich, du, and ich, es. Pardon the mispronunciation if you know better. If you know better, let me know. To categorize the modes of consciousness, interaction, and being through which an individual engages with other individuals, okay? At all times, a person is engaged with the world in one of these modes. So he's saying we have two modes of interacting with the world, okay? And here's one, ich, du, meaning I, thou, or I, you. But this is saying, this is a relationship between two beings. It is a concrete encounter because these beings meet one another in an authentic existence without any qualification, no objectification of people. Imagination and ideas do not play a role in this relationship. Two lovers, an observer and a cat, and so on. Common English words used to describe this relationship include encounter, meeting, dialogue, mutuality, exchange. He says, this relationship, the I-thou relationship, is one that can exist between a human being and God. And he says, it is the only way in which it is possible to interact with God. And that if you have the same relationship with a person, you are at the same time connecting with God. He says that if you have this I-thou relationship, which is an experience of the other person, let's say, or the other person, what you're having a relationship with, if you're open to the I-thou, God will eventually come to you in response to your welcome. You make yourself open, God comes to you. You believe that God is there, oh, there he is. Also, because the God Buber describes is completely devoid of qualities, this I-thou relationship lasts as long as the individual wills it. Once you stop thinking, once you forget God's there, he's still there, but you lose the relationship with him. It's up to you to keep looking for him. When the individual finally refers to the I-it way of relating, this acts as a barrier to deeper relationship and community. That's the other way of relating, I-it. Ich, es, I-it, okay. It's nearly the opposite. In the prior one, there's an encounter, there's a connection, there's a mutual experience. But this is not the case with the second one. The I confronts, you treat it as an object. All such objects are considered merely mental representations created and sustained by the individual mind. You treat other things, people, as objects to be used and experienced. Okay. And how an object can serve the individual's interest. I would dare say, unfortunately, that there's a whole lot of Jews that do that. You know, God, I need something from you. It's almost like you work for me. And even if you think God's above you, you're treating him as a thing, to like a distributor of blessings. You know, I'm placing my order now for these blessings, please. I need health and prosperity and a job and a better relationship. You know, it's like a delivery service. You know, you're placing an order. I think that's what he's talking about here. And certainly the grossest example of this that I can think of is Avodah Zorah, where you're actually going to some tree or a bush or whatever it is, or some animal, and saying, all right, you, I need something from you, and I'm going to worship you because I need you to help me get food or rain, whatever it is. So I think that's the grossest and most perverted application of that mindset. Buber argued that human life consists of an oscillation between ikdu and ik-es, and that in fact, these ikdu experiences where there's a connection are rather few and far between. Okay. Okay, and he says that, you know, you're on a rocky road of devaluing the world around you, if that's how you go about your business. So why is this important to what Rabbi Kaplan says? It's because Rabbi Kaplan is basically saying we have these two modalities. We kind of have to treat, you know, we have this abstraction of God as it's kind of like a principle where he's undefinable, but we have to have a relationship with this. And Rabbi Kaplan saying, yeah, you know, we kind of call him a being, but the trap here, as Buber's explaining, is if you start calling God a being, you're going to treat him as an object, and you're going to treat him as something to get something from. You're going to objectify him. So there's a temptation to do that. So the idea is to kind of get on that road and kind of transcend it. So my understanding of what Rabbi Kaplan is trying to get us to do is say, okay, maybe you want to start off treating God as a being, because that helps you understand the idea of being close to something, but don't go so far as to make him a being in your mind. You know, start off like that, but pick yourself up into a higher way of perceiving things, so that you don't treat him like a being, you have a connection with him. And obviously the connection can't be just with your ordinary mind, it's got to be with an enhanced state of consciousness. So I think Rabbi Kaplan would say to Martin Buber, we got you. That's exactly right. There are these two modalities, and Rabbi Kaplan would say, okay, what I want people to do is start off at this level and start thinking in terms of God being a being, but by meditation, being able to expand their perception and start realizing God's not a being, and he's greater than a being, and I can still connect with him. That's what I'm getting out of this. Okay, which again emphasizes the importance of meditation, so you could do this kind of advanced way of thinking, starting off on the track where you're objectifying God, but then rising above that and saying, nope, I'm being close to God as if he is a being, but I know he's not a being, but I still feel close. You have to have an enhanced way of perceiving the world in order to do that. And you can't do it without meditation. That I know for sure. Okay. So Martin Buber was related to the Maharam. in the 14 to 1500s. One of the big things you might have heard about him was he actually translated the Mishnah Torah from Maimonides. That's a big thing for him. Okay. Okay. All right. So we just left off with this dilemma of trying to connect with the intangible when we're used to connecting with tangibles. Okay. Rabbi Kaplan has a little other something to say about this. Okay. Okay, so what book are we using? This book. This is an anthology, one of 2 volumes of Rabbi Kaplan's books. This has 4 different ones in it. One of them is called Immortality and the Soul. Let's see what that says. This is what he says. We say that God created the world in order to bestow good in it, good to it. But what is this good? What good does God have to offer his world? First of all, we must realize that any good that God gives must be the ultimate good that his creation can accept. Key point, he doesn't blow the circuits. He understands the limits of people. The psalmist said in Tehillim 31:20, how great is your good stored up for those who fear you. Our sages interpret this to say that God bestows good in the greatest possible abundance. In another place, they teach us that this verse means that God is telling us, you according to your strength and me according to mine. In other words, God gives us the greatest good that we can possibly accept. But what is this ultimate good? What is the greatest possible good that God can bestow? If we think about it, the answer is really simple. The greatest possible good is God himself. There is no other ultimate true good. The psalmist thus said, I have no good but you. And the Talmud, Rabbi Acha interprets this to mean that no true good exists in the world except that of God himself. The ultimate good is therefore to partake of God, and it is this good that he planned to give the world. He would create a world where creatures ultimately could partake of his essence. The psalmist sings of this in Tehillim 34:9, taste and see that God is good. Happy is the man who finds refuge in him. God therefore created the world in such a way that man could draw close to him and partake of his essence. Of course, we are not speaking of physical closeness, but of spiritual closeness. Such closeness involves the knowledge and understanding of God, as well as resembling him to the greatest degree possible. And we'll discuss this later. Okay, but we're talking about spiritual closeness. Okay. So this is his way of saying that as we said, like as he said earlier, when we say Baruch, and we say a blessing, and the blessing is for livelihood, or the blessing is for sick people, or the blessing is for the ingathering of the exiles, we're following this thought train, and the train is basically saying, well, I'm trying to pray for something good. Good is healing, or good is a job, or good is produce of the land. And where does that come from? Well, I'm talking to God right now, and God is the source of everything good. And what is the ultimate good? It's God himself. So basically our understanding of the prayer is that when we pray, we go through that thought train, and realizing that when we actually are praying for health or for money, we're actually praying using prayer as a medium to get close to the ultimate good, which is God. The good we want from God is the pathway to getting the ultimate good, which is a connection with God himself. And he goes as far as to say here that that's experienced, that the objective of the prayer is not just, well, I hope now that we all get healthy, or I hope now that we get what we prayed for. That's like a side benefit. The ultimate benefit is the experience of God somehow. Okay. And so prayer has an experiential component that's supposed to be transcendent. And obviously you need to be able to get yourself the proper skills to be able to think that way and experience life that way. And that's why he keeps talking about meditation. Okay. To bring this down to earth a little bit, we're going to talk about a little bit of Stephen Siebold. Again, world-class expert on mental toughness and becoming a member of the world class. This is what he says. And this is how it relates to what Rabbi Kaplan says. His first short essay says, the world class connects to the source through gratitude. The world class is famous for using non-linear thinking as a primary problem-solving strategy, and nowhere is this more apparent than when it comes to heightening their creativity. While amateurs become increasingly stressed during problem-solving, the great ones become more relaxed to enhance their creative ability. Champions know the ultimate creative force is located somewhere beyond their everyday consciousness, and they must tap this source to generate their best ideas. The secular sometimes refer to this source as the unconscious mind. The spiritual often call it God. Whatever label their belief warrants, few deny the power of the source, whatever its point of origin. Champions know the fastest way to connect to the source is through gratitude. Thoughts and feelings of gratitude seem to elevate the performer's consciousness to a higher place than is accessible than any other means. Professional writers call it being connected, athletes call it being in the zone, psychologists refer to it as a state of flow. No matter what name you assign it, the experience is the same. It's a process that begins by letting go and mentally detaching from the end result or outcome of any task. That's exactly what we're talking about. The focus is on being as opposed to doing. While both amateurs and pros experience this phenomenon from time to time, the great ones are able to access it much more often because they are aware of the triggers that create a mental climate conducive to the state of mind. Gratitude is the mindset of choice when they need to awaken the giant and tap their genius. He's describing the process that Rabbi Kaplan was describing, because we're talking about, well, he called it nonlinear thinking. We're talking about getting past the thinking where we're objectifying God. You know, that's what we're used to doing. But we have to get past that by using another mode of thinking. And he's saying by doing that, we want to be able to connect. We want to be able to go to the source of what we're thinking about, of what we desire. The source we established is God. So he says when basketball players or athletes say they're in the zone, he says they are connecting to God in that particular way, not through tefillah, but through whatever they're doing, which is kind of believable. Okay. And he's saying that an attitude of gratitude is a really quick way to shift gears and click into that way of thinking. Okay. The other essay that he has talks about forming an attitude of gratitude, which we don't have to get into because I want to be able to get into the meditation. But his point there is that very successful people, in order to form an attitude, they program themselves to think positively and to have an attitude of gratitude. And that, of course, as we established last week, is itself meditation. This self-programming and self-talk, when you talk yourself into a mindset, is a form of meditation. And at a future class, we're going to get into that much more in depth. Rabbi Kaplan actually has essays that show how biblical words imply that. It's really interesting. Okay. 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 Now, before we meditate, we're going to answer this question from our student. The question again was, I was planning on trying to do tonight's meditation standing, but decided against it since I often go deep enough that I may lose my balance or be taken away from the meditative state by focusing on staying balanced. Your thoughts on that? By the way, nobody's muted, so if you have a comment as I give my answer, feel free. My first answer is standing meditation and standing while meditating are two different activities. Remember in the class last week, we were talking about standing meditation. Okay, so here's the points. First of all, you have the same problem of balance whether you're sitting or standing. You can get into a deep meditative state when you're sitting. And if you're not properly structured, you could also lose your balance and fall over. So you have the same problem. But when you're sitting, you have less to worry about with regards to your balance, because half your bodies, you don't have to worry about. You have to worry about what's happening with your legs. You have to worry about what's happening with your hips. You just have to worry about what's happening from your hips up to your head. So it's easier to go deep and get the skills of having deep meditation when you're sitting. You can go really deep, okay. But does that mean that you can't go deep when you're standing? No, it doesn't mean that. Going deep while standing requires advanced physical training. Why? Because, I mean, how many people here can actually stand absolutely still for 10 minutes? And I mean still, without worried about your posture, your hip, your neck, your back, your belly, your ankles. You know, it takes physical training. And in that standing meditation that we talked about last week, that's what that training does. It gives your body the strength and the structure so that you could stand in place for a long time. If your body has that strength and structure, then yeah, you can stand and meditate and go deep and not worry about your balance, because your body is naturally balanced. You've trained your body to assume that balance. And this is not the kind of training that you get in the gym or, you know, this is specific training that you get for the purpose of being able to have that erect structure, perfect balance, so that you can meditate or do martial arts, or I'm sure dancers do it. Okay. So that's the answer to the question. If you're a deep meditator and you want to meditate standing up and you're concerned about your balance, you're probably right to be concerned about it, because your body isn't strong enough to maintain the balance. If you train yourself so that your body has that strength, this will not be a worry. You could go as deep standing as you can sitting, because your body can take it. So go forth and train. Which brings up, I wanted to go over that standing meditation today and actually show the short video that's on the website we looked at last week, because it's a marvel, and it's good training, not just for meditation, but for living and moving around in the world. So I'm going to dedicate next class to this. Okay, and we'll get a further understanding about what Rabbi Kaplan means when he talks about the importance of being receptive and ready when you're standing still during the Amidah. Okay, so we are now going to meditate. I'm going to stop the recording.